They called it the Speerwagen, the scout car. That was the mistake. On the morning of December 18th, 1944, near the Belgian village of Stavelot, a column of German half-tracks moved through the pre-dawn darkness. Inside the lead SDKFZ 251, Oberfeldwebel Klaus Meyer watched the road ahead through the vehicle's open top. His crew had been moving since midnight, part of Kampfgruppe Paper's spearhead, driving deep into American lines during what would later be called the Battle of the Bulge. The half-tracks were Hanomag-built, reliable vehicles that had carried German infantry across Russia, through North Africa, across France in 1940. 8 millimeters of armor on the front, enough to stop rifle fire and shell fragments. Open-topped, yes, but that allowed the crew to dismount quickly and provided better visibility than a closed vehicle. Meyer trusted his half-track. It had brought him through 3 years of war. Then he saw it. A low, angular shape blocking the road intersection ahead. 6 wheels, not tracks. A turret with what looked like a small gun. An American armored car. What the intelligence briefings called an M8 Greyhound. Reconnaissance vehicle, lightly armed, fast but fragile. The kind of vehicle that ran away when it encountered real combat power. Meyer's gunner already had the MG-42 machine gun trained on the American vehicle. The half-track commander made a quick calculation. The armored car was alone. His column had 3 half-tracks and a Panzer IV tank somewhere behind in the convoy. If the American crew had any sense, they would reverse and disappear before the Germans could close the distance. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Greyhound didn't move. Its turret traversed slowly, the barrel of its gun coming to bear on the lead half-track. Meyer saw the muzzle flash. He heard the sharp crack of a small caliber gun firing. Then he felt the impact. The 37mm armor-piercing round struck the front plate of the SDKFZ 251 at a range of approximately 200 meters. The 8mm armor, designed to resist small arms fire and fragmentation, offered no meaningful resistance. The round punched through cleanly, traveling through the crew compartment at over 2,000 feet per second. Meyer never knew what killed him. The round struck the radio equipment mounted behind the driver's position, fragmenting into dozens of pieces of shrapnel that tore through the cramped interior. The driver slumped forward. The vehicle coasted to a stop, engine still running, blocking the road. The second half-track in the column tried to swing around the disabled lead vehicle. The Greyhound's turret traversed again. Another shot, another penetration. This round struck the half-track side armor, only 6 millimeters thick. It went through both sides of the vehicle, entering the left and exiting the right, passing through the crew compartment in between. By the time the third half-track reversed and the column scattered for cover, 2 German vehicles were disabled and 11 men were dead or wounded. The American armored car, its commander having accomplished exactly what he had been ordered to do, reversed smoothly and disappeared down a side road. Its crew had fired 4 rounds. The Germans who survived would spend the rest of that cold December morning trying to understand what had happened. They had been told the American armored cars were reconnaissance vehicles, scouts, observers. They had been told these wheeled vehicles avoided combat, that they were thinly armored and lightly armed, suitable only for screening and reporting enemy positions. No one had told them that a scout car's gun could kill a half-track. The SDKFZ 251 half-track was not an accident of design. It was the product of careful military thinking that stretched back to the mid-1930s, when German planners recognized that mechanized warfare required infantry to keep pace with tanks. Traditional infantry moved at walking speed, approximately 3 miles per hour. Motorized infantry riding in trucks could move at 30 miles per hour on roads, but trucks were soft-skinned vehicles vulnerable to small arms fire. They offered no protection and could not operate in combat zones. The solution was the armored half-track, a vehicle that combined the road speed of a truck with enough armor to protect its crew from rifle fire and shell fragments. Hanomag, a German engineering firm in Hanover, received the development contract in 1937. The specifications were specific. The vehicle would carry 10 infantrymen plus a crew of 2. It would have armour sufficient to resist rifle-caliber bullets and fragmentation from artillery near misses. It would be open-topped to allow the infantry to fire their weapons while mounted and to dismount rapidly when reaching the objective. It would use a track and wheel system, with wheels in front for steering and tracks in the rear for cross-country mobility. What German intelligence failed to calculate was whether a 37mm gun could penetrate the armour of a SDKFZ 251 half-track. The mathematics were simple, but apparently no one performed them. 8mm of armour on the half-track's frontal plate. 37mm armour-piercing rounds capable of penetrating 36mm at 500 yards. The gun had 4 times the penetrating power necessary to defeat the half-track's best armour. At typical combat ranges under 500 meters, the M8's gun could punch through the half-track's armor as if it were sheet metal. The rounds would penetrate cleanly, travel through the crew compartment, and either exit through the opposite side or fragment inside, turning the interior into a killing zone. The open top that German doctrine considered an advantage in dismounting infantry became a fatal vulnerability when fighting against an adversary with the ability to fire into the crew compartment from angles that passed through the thin side armour. By December 1944, when Kampfgruppe Paper's half-tracks rolled into Belgium during the opening phase of the Battle of the Bulge, thousands of M8 Greyhounds were operating across Western Europe. They had proven themselves effective reconnaissance vehicles, fast and reliable. Their crews had learned the vehicle's capabilities and limitations through months of combat. The German troops in the half-tracks had learned nothing about the Greyhounds' lethality against their vehicles. They still thought of the M8 as a scout car, lightly armed and no threat to armoured vehicles. The morning of December 18th would teach them otherwise. The M8 Greyhound that blocked the road at Stavelot that December morning was assigned to Troop B, 87th Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, part of the 7th Armoured Division. The vehicle had been in service since August 1944, landing in France shortly after the breakout from Normandy. Its crew had been together for 5 months, long enough to know their vehicle's capabilities intimately. Staff Sergeant Robert Harper commanded the vehicle. He was 24 years old, from Michigan, a former automobile mechanic who had enlisted in 1942. His training at Fort Riley, Kansas had been thorough and practical. 6 weeks learning cavalry tactics, vehicle maintenance, radio procedures, and gunnery. The Army taught reconnaissance crews to think of their armoured cars as mobile observation posts, not as fighting vehicles. But the training also emphasised that when combat was unavoidable, the 37mm gun was a legitimate weapon. Harper's gunner, Corporal James Mitchell, had fired hundreds of practice rounds during training. He knew the M6 gun's ballistics, knew how to estimate range, knew which ammunition to select for different targets. Armour-piercing shot for vehicles, high explosive for infantry and soft targets, canister rounds for close-range defence against infantry assault. The gun could fire 15 to 20 rounds per minute with a skilled crew. The turret held 16 ready rounds in racks, with another 44 stored in the hull. The ammunition itself was simple but effective. The armour-piercing shot, designated APC for armour-piercing capped, weighed 1.61 pounds. The projectile had a hardened steel core designed to punch through armour plate. Upon penetration, the round would continue through the target, fragmenting as it travelled. The cap on the nose helped the round bite into armour rather than glancing off at angles. At the factory in St. Paul, each M8 underwent rigorous testing before acceptance. The armour plates were inspected for flaws. The engine ran for hours on test stands. The transmission shifted through all gears repeatedly. The suspension was tested on rough terrain courses that simulated combat conditions. The gun was bore-sighted and test-fired. Only vehicles that passed every inspection were accepted for military service. By December 1944, the 87th Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron had its full complement of M8 Greyhounds, approximately 54 vehicles organized into 3 reconnaissance troops and 1 assault gun troop. Each reconnaissance troop had 3 platoons. Each platoon had 3 armored cars. The vehicles operated in pairs when possible, providing mutual support and allowing one vehicle to observe while the other moved. The squadron's mission during the Battle of the Bulge was to screen the 7th Armoured Division's flanks and provide early warning of German movements. On the morning of December 18th, Troop B was positioned to cover road approaches south of Stavelot. Harper's crew had been at their position since before dawn, watching the road through the dim light of early morning. German reconnaissance had noted American armoured cars in the area. Kampfgruppe Piper's intelligence officer had been briefed on American reconnaissance practices. The Americans used wheeled armoured cars for screening, typically pulling back when they encountered strong opposition. The intelligence assessment described these vehicles as having light armour and light armament, suitable for observation but not for sustained combat. The reports mentioned 37mm guns, but characterized them as ineffective against armoured vehicles. This assessment was based on the 37mm gun's performance against German tanks and assault guns. A Panzer IV's frontal armour was 80mm thick. A Panther's frontal armour was 100mm. Even a Stooge 3 assault gun had 80mm on the superstructure front. Against these targets, a 37mm gun was useless. Rounds would bounce off harmlessly at any range. What the intelligence assessment failed to address was the 37mm gun's performance against lighter targets. The SDKFZ 251 half-track, with its 8mm frontal armour and 6mm side armour, fell well within the penetration envelope of the 37mm armour-piercing round. At ranges under 1,000 yards, the gun could penetrate the half-track from any angle. At ranges under 500 yards, the rounds would overmatch the armour completely, punching through with energy to spare. The ballistic tables were clear on this point. At 200 meters range, the 37mm APC round retained a velocity of approximately 2,600 feet per second. At this velocity, the round could penetrate 48mm of homogeneous armour plate. The half-track's 8mm armour represented less than 1/5 of the gun's penetration capability at that range. The round would go through as easily as a rifle bullet through plywood. Inside a half-track, the crew compartment measured approximately 4 meters long, 1.8 meters wide, and 1.5 meters tall at the highest point. When a 37mm round penetrated the front armour, it had 4 meters of space to travel before exiting through the rear. In that space were seated or standing up to 12 men, the driver, the vehicle commander, and 10 infantry passengers. The round would strike the first solid object in its path, fragmenting into dozens of pieces of shrapnel, each piece travelling at lethal velocity. There was no internal armour, no protection, nothing to stop the fragments from ricocheting through the crew compartment multiple times. German half-track crews had no training for this scenario. Their vehicle doctrine assumed that if they encountered enemy armour or anti-tank guns, they would dismount their infantry and withdraw while heavier German vehicles engaged the threat. The half-track was a battle taxi, not a combat vehicle. It was never supposed to be in a position where enemy guns could engage it directly. But reconnaissance doctrine sometimes placed half-tracks in exactly these vulnerable positions. German mechanized reconnaissance units used half-tracks to transport infantry rapidly along roads, probing for enemy positions. When they made contact, the doctrine called for the infantry to dismount and develop the situation, while the half-tracks provided covering fire with their machine guns. If enemy armour appeared, the half-tracks would withdraw while the reconnaissance infantry called for anti-tank support. This doctrine worked well when the enemy followed predictable patterns. If American armoured cars withdrew when they encountered German forces, as intelligence suggested they would, then the half-tracks were safe. But if an American armoured car chose to fight, if its commander decided that his 37mm gun could engage the German vehicles effectively, then the doctrine broke down catastrophically. Harper's training at Fort Riley had included target identification. He had been taught to recognize German vehicles by silhouette. Trucks, half-tracks, armoured cars, tanks, assault guns. He knew that half-tracks were thin-skinned vehicles, that their armor was designed to stop small arms fire but nothing heavier. He had been told explicitly during training that his 37mm gun could penetrate half-track armor at combat ranges. When he saw the German column approaching in the pre-dawn light, Harper made a rapid tactical assessment. 3 half-tracks, moving in column formation. No tanks visible in the immediate area. Range approximately 200 meters. The lead vehicle was exposed on the road with no cover available. His own vehicle was in a hull-down position with good fields of fire and a clear route for withdrawal if necessary. The decision to engage took perhaps 3 seconds. Mitchell already had the gun laid on the lead vehicle. Harper gave the fire command. The breech of the 37mm gun was loaded with an armor-piercing round. Mitchell pressed the trigger. The gun recoiled, the spent shell casing ejected, and Harper watched through his periscope as the tracer element in the round arced toward the target. The impact was visible even in the dim morning light, a flash of sparks where the round struck the half-track's frontal armor. The vehicle's forward motion stopped immediately. Through his vision blocks, Harper could see the vehicle was disabled. No smoke yet, but it was clearly out of action. Mitchell was already loading the second round. The turret traverse motor hummed as Harper adjusted aim to the second vehicle in the column. The German driver was attempting to maneuver around the disabled lead vehicle. Mitchell fired. Another hit, this time on the side. Armor. Harper saw the round's tracer continue through the vehicle, exiting on the far side. The second half-track slewed to a stop, its driver either dead or incapacitated. The third half-track in Kampfgruppe Piper's column reversed frantically, its driver throwing the vehicle into gear and backing away from the intersection. Unteroffizier Hans Weber, commanding the third vehicle, had watched in disbelief as both vehicles ahead of him were hit and stopped within seconds of each other. His training had not prepared him for this. American scout cars were supposed to run away, not stand and fight. They were reconnaissance vehicles, not tank destroyers. Weber screamed orders to his driver to get off the road, to find cover. The half-track backed into a side street, the driver fighting with the steering wheel to navigate backwards while watching through his small rear vision port. The vehicle lurched over the curb, tracks throwing up dirt and debris. Weber's machine gunner was trying to identify the source of the fire, traversing the MG-42 back and forth, but in the dim morning light and with muzzle flash as the only indicator, he could not acquire the target. At the intersection, Harper ordered Mitchell to hold fire. The third vehicle had withdrawn out of sight. Engaging it would mean exposing their position further and potentially drawing fire from other German vehicles in the area. Harper's mission was reconnaissance and screening, not sustained combat. He had accomplished the immediate objective, stopping the German column from using this road. Now he needed to report and withdraw before German reinforcements arrived. The radio operator called back to the troop command post, reporting contact with German armor. 3 half-tracks engaged, 2 disabled, 1 withdrawn. The transmission took less than 30 seconds. Harper ordered his driver to back the Greyhound out of its position and move to their alternate position 300 meters south. The vehicle's engine responded smoothly, the 6 wheels providing excellent traction as they reversed down the narrow street. Behind them, German infantry were dismounting from vehicles further back in the column. Weber's half-track crew was attempting to recover wounded from the 2 disabled vehicles. What they found was devastating. The first half-track, hit in the frontal armor, had the round enter just above the driver's position. The armor-piercing shot had punched through cleanly, travelled the length of the crew compartment, struck the radio equipment, and fragmented. The driver was dead, killed instantly when fragments struck him in the back. The vehicle commander was dead, caught by fragments that ricocheted through the cramped interior. 3 of the 10 infantry passengers in the rear compartment were dead. 4 more were wounded, some seriously. The second half-track was worse. The 37mm round had struck the side armor at an almost perpendicular angle, penetrating at a point just behind the driver's compartment. The round travelled through the crew area, passed through 2 men completely, and exited through the opposite side armor. 5 dead, 3 wounded. The vehicle commander was trying to organize medical aid for the wounded, while also trying to understand what had happened. Oberleutnant Friedrich Steiner, the platoon commander, arrived at the scene within minutes. He had been riding in a half-track further back in the column and had heard the engagement. What he saw shook him. 2 vehicles disabled, 8 men dead, 7 wounded. Clean holes punched through the armor. The entry wounds were roughly 37 millimeters in diameter. The size of the round that had made them was obvious. An American armored car with a 37 millimeter gun had done this. Steiner had been in combat since 1941. He had fought in Russia, where Soviet anti-tank rifles and 45 millimeter guns had penetrated half-tracks many times. He had lost vehicles in France to American bazookas and to tank fire, but those were dedicated anti-tank weapons. This was different. This was an armored car, a reconnaissance vehicle, something that German intelligence had characterized as lightly armed and no threat to armored vehicles. He examined the penetration holes carefully. The armor had been defeated completely. There was no evidence of glancing blows or partial penetration. The rounds had gone straight through. At this range, perhaps 200 meters based on where survivors said the American vehicle had been positioned, the 37 millimeter gun had more than enough power to defeat 8 millimeter armor. The mathematics were simple. Steiner realized immediately that every half-track in the column was vulnerable to these weapons. The intelligence briefings had been wrong, or rather, they had been incomplete. Yes, American armored cars mounted 37 millimeter guns that were ineffective against German tanks. But those same guns were highly effective against half-tracks, armored cars, light reconnaissance vehicles, and any other target with armor under 30 millimeters thick. At typical combat ranges, the American reconnaissance vehicles could kill German reconnaissance vehicles. Weber, the commander who had survived by pulling back, reported to Steiner. His crew had heard the impacts on the vehicles ahead of them. They had seen the muzzle flash from the American position. Weber said his first instinct had been that they were under attack from a tank destroyer or an anti-tank gun. Only when he had backed away and gained some perspective did he realize it had been an armored car. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. If armored cars could kill half-tracks, then half-track crews were vulnerable every time they encountered American reconnaissance units. German combat reports from that day reflect the confusion and concern. Kampfgruppe Piper's war diary noted the engagement at Stavelot, recording the loss of 2 half-tracks to enemy fire. The initial report characterized the attack as coming from anti-tank guns. Later reports, after interrogation of survivors and examination of the vehicles, corrected this to armored cars. One report specifically noted that American reconnaissance vehicles mounted guns capable of penetrating half-track armor at combat ranges. This information was not new to German intelligence. The specifications for the M8 Greyhound were known. The capabilities of the 37 millimeter gun were documented. What had been missing was the analytical step of calculating whether these guns posed a threat to German vehicles. The assumption had been that 37 millimeter guns were obsolete anti-tank weapons, and therefore not dangerous. No one had apparently considered that obsolete anti-tank weapons might still be perfectly adequate anti-half-track weapons. American after-action reports from the same engagement were matter of fact. Staff Sergeant Harper filed his combat report on December 19th, noting that his crew had engaged 3 enemy half-tracks at approximately 03:30 hours, scoring 2 penetrating hits and causing 1 vehicle to withdraw. The report estimated 8 to 10 enemy casualties. Harper noted that his vehicle withdrew without damage and repositioned as ordered. The entire engagement had lasted less than 2 minutes. For Harper and his crew, the engagement confirmed what they had been taught in training. The 37 millimeter gun could defeat light armor. Half-tracks were light armor. Therefore, the gun could defeat half-tracks. The logic was straightforward. Mitchell, the gunner, reported that both rounds he fired had been direct hits at a range he estimated as 200 yards. Both rounds penetrated. The gun performed exactly as expected. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The psychological difference between the two sides was stark. German crews discovered that their vehicles were vulnerable to weapons they had not considered threatening. American crews confirmed that their weapons worked as designed against appropriate targets. One side experienced shock and revelation. The other side experienced validation and confidence. News of the Stavelot engagement spread through Kampfgruppe Piper over the following days. Other units reported similar encounters. Near Stoumont, a platoon of half-tracks encountered two M8 Greyhounds blocking a crossroad. The American vehicles engaged from hull-down positions at approximately 300 meters. 3 half-tracks were hit before the column could withdraw and call for tank support. By the time a Panzer IV arrived to suppress the American position, the Greyhounds had withdrawn. 7 more German soldiers were dead and 5 were wounded. Near Trois Ponts, a reconnaissance patrol in half-tracks ran into an American cavalry screen. The Americans had positioned multiple armoured cars to cover the approaches to a bridge. When the German half-tracks approached, 3 M8s opened fire simultaneously from different positions. The crossfire was devastating. 4 half-tracks were hit in the first 30 seconds. The surviving vehicles withdrew under smoke, abandoning the attempt to seize the bridge. The engagement lasted less than 5 minutes. 14 German soldiers died, 9 were wounded. Each engagement followed the same pattern. German half-tracks approached an American position. American armoured cars engaged from covered positions at ranges between 200 and 500 meters. The 37mm guns penetrated the half-track armour cleanly. The half-tracks, unable to respond effectively with their machine guns and unwilling to close to point-blank range where their infantry could engage, withdrew and called for heavier support. By the time tanks or assault guns arrived, the American armoured cars had displaced to alternate positions. Within 3 days of the start of the German offensive, half-track commanders throughout the attacking formations understood they faced a serious threat from American reconnaissance vehicles. Orders went out to battalion and regiment level. Half-tracks were not to engage American armoured cars without tank support. Reconnaissance patrols that encountered M8s were to report the contact and withdraw rather than attempting to fight through. This represented a fundamental shift in German tactical doctrine. Half-tracks had been aggressive reconnaissance and infantry transport vehicles, expected to push forward rapidly and develop enemy positions through contact. Now they were being ordered to avoid contact with one of the most common vehicles in the American infantry. Every American reconnaissance unit, every cavalry squadron, every mechanized cavalry troop was equipped with M8 Greyhounds. There were thousands of them across the Western Front. The tactical implications were significant. German reconnaissance became more cautious, more hesitant. Half-track patrols that previously would have pushed aggressively to find American positions now held back when they suspected enemy reconnaissance vehicles were in the area. This slowed German tempo and gave American forces more time to identify German movements and respond. German commanders recognized the problem immediately. Obersturmbannführer Jochen Piper, commanding the Kampfgruppe that bore his name, noted in his combat journal that American armoured cars were proving unexpectedly dangerous to his reconnaissance elements. He requested additional tank support for his forward units, but tanks were needed for the main assault and could not be spared for escort duty with half-tracks. The solution some German units adopted was to lead reconnaissance patrols with a tank or assault gun, with half-tracks following behind. This provided the firepower to engage American armoured cars effectively. A Panzer IV's 75mm gun or a Stooge 3's 75mm gun could destroy an M8 at any combat range. The American vehicle's half-inch frontal armour was no protection against these weapons, but this solution created new problems. Tanks were slower than half-tracks on roads, reducing the speed of reconnaissance. Tanks consumed far more fuel than half-tracks, straining already stretched logistics. And tanks were needed for the primary offensive operations, not for escorting reconnaissance vehicles. Every tank assigned to escort duty was a tank not available for the spearhead. Some German units tried using armoured cars for reconnaissance instead of half-tracks. The SDKFZ 232 8-wheel armoured car had 20mm guns and better armour than the half-track. But these vehicles were rare, with only limited numbers available. Most reconnaissance units still depended on half-tracks for their mobility and infantry carrying capacity. The impact on German infantry morale was subtle but real. The Panzer Grenadiers who rode in the half-tracks had trusted these vehicles to protect them from small arms fire during the approach to combat. Now they understood that American reconnaissance vehicles could penetrate their armour easily. The psychological comfort of riding in an armoured vehicle evaporated. The half-track was still better than walking or riding in an unarmoured truck, but it was no longer the secure mobile fortress it had seemed. American reconnaissance units, meanwhile, gained confidence. The word spread through cavalry squadrons and reconnaissance battalions: your 37mm gun can kill half-tracks. Crew after crew reported successful engagements. The M8's reputation grew from scout car to can fight if necessary. Commanders became more willing to order their armoured cars to stand and fight when the tactical situation warranted it. Training doctrine in the United States was updated to reflect the combat experience. New crews arriving in Europe were explicitly taught that their 37mm guns were effective against German half-tracks, armoured cars, and other light armoured vehicles. Gunnery training included exercises, engaging targets representing half-tracks at various ranges. The message was clear. You are not helpless if you encounter German light armour. The industrial and design implications were equally significant. The M8 had been designed as a reconnaissance vehicle, with the gun included primarily for self-defense against enemy reconnaissance units. Combat experience proved the design was sound. The 37mm gun, obsolete for anti-tank work, was perfectly adequate for its intended role. The vehicle's speed allowed it to choose when and where to fight. The armour was sufficient to protect against small arms and fragments while keeping weight low enough for good mobility. German planners, reviewing the combat reports, recognized they had made a fundamental miscalculation. They had designed the half-track's armour to resist the threats they expected on the battlefield in the late 1930s: rifles, machine guns, and artillery fragments. They had not adequately considered the threat from light anti-tank weapons or from guns in the 37 to 45mm range. By the time this became apparent in combat, it was too late to redesign the vehicle. Germany's industrial capacity was fully committed to existing production, and introducing a new half-track design would have disrupted production for months. The story of the M8 Greyhound and the SDKFZ 251 half-track entered the historical record through official combat reports, unit histories, and post-war interviews with participants. American cavalry units recorded their engagements matter-of-factly, noting targets engaged and rounds expended. German units reported losses and requested tactical guidance on how to deal with the threat. Military historians on both sides eventually compiled these records into comprehensive assessments of reconnaissance operations during World War II. The United States Army Armor School at Fort Knox, Kentucky, conducted detailed studies of cavalry operations in Europe after the war. The studies examined hundreds of engagements involving M8 Greyhounds, analyzing what worked and what did not. The conclusion was that the M8 had been highly effective in its designed role. The vehicle provided excellent reconnaissance capability, had sufficient firepower to engage enemy light armor, and was reliable enough to operate far from supply lines. The 37mm gun, while obsolete for anti-tank work against medium and heavy tanks, was perfectly adequate against reconnaissance vehicles, half-tracks, and light fortifications. These studies influenced post-war armoured car design. The M38 Wolfhound, which replaced the Greyhound in the 1950s, retained many of the M8's design features while incorporating lessons learned from combat. The new vehicle was larger, better armoured, and mounted a 76mm gun, but the basic concept remained the same: a fast, wheeled reconnaissance vehicle with enough firepower to fight through light opposition. German military historians, conducting their own post-war analysis, reached different conclusions. The half-track had been a successful design for its intended purpose, but that purpose had been defined in the late 1930s based on the threats Germany expected to face. By 1944, the battlefield had evolved in ways that made the half-track increasingly vulnerable. The German army had recognized this during the war and had attempted to develop better protected vehicles. But resource constraints and production priorities meant these improved designs never reached the front lines in significant numbers. The Federal Republic of Germany, rebuilding its military in the 1950s as part of NATO, chose not to develop new half-tracks. Instead, they adopted fully tracked armoured personnel carriers with thicker armour and enclosed crew compartments. The M113, an American-designed vehicle that became standard throughout NATO, had aluminum armour up to 38 mm thick on the frontal arc, twice the protection of the wartime half-track. The lessons of World War II influenced this decision. Mechanized infantry needed better protection than half-tracks could provide. For the veterans who had fought in these vehicles, the memories remained vivid decades after the war. Weber, the German half-track commander who had survived the Stavelot engagement, immigrated to Canada after the war and rarely spoke about his combat experience. But in a 1982 interview with a military historian, he described December 18, 1944, as the day he understood Germany would lose the war. Not because of the two half-tracks destroyed, but because of what those destroyed vehicles represented. American forces had equipment that worked, in quantities that seemed endless, operated by crews who were well-trained and confident. German forces were making do with equipment that was increasingly inadequate, in quantities that could not replace losses, operated by crews who knew they were outmatched. Harper, the American armored car commander, returned to Michigan after the war and resumed his career as an automobile mechanic. He owned a service station in Detroit for 35 years. The Bronze Star citation hung on the wall of his office, but he rarely discussed it with customers. In a 1976 newspaper interview commemorating the Battle of the Bulge, he described the December engagement simply, "We had a good vehicle, good training, and good equipment. We did our job. That's all there was to it." Mitchell, Harper's gunner, became a high school teacher in Ohio. He taught history and occasionally mentioned his wartime service when discussing World War II with his students. His description of combat was clinical and unemotional. He had aimed the gun, pressed the trigger, and hit the target. The training had worked. The equipment had functioned as designed. The outcome was what any competent crew should have achieved under those circumstances. The difference in perspective between the German and American veterans was striking. German survivors remembered the shock, the disbelief, the realization that their equipment was inadequate. American veterans remembered confirming what they had been taught, validating their training, and accomplishing their mission with tools that worked as advertised. One side experienced revelation and defeat. The other side experienced validation and confidence. The broader historical significance of these engagements lies not in their immediate tactical impact, which was relatively minor, but in what they revealed about industrial warfare between modern nations. Victory in such conflicts depends on industrial capacity, logistical systems, training infrastructure, and the ability to produce reliable equipment in quantities sufficient to equip entire armies. Individual weapons systems matter less than the overall system that produces, delivers, maintains, and employs those weapons. The M8 Greyhound was not a remarkable vehicle by the standards of World War II. It was not the fastest armoured car, not the best armed, not the most heavily protected, but it was good enough for its mission, reliable enough to stay operational, and produced in quantities large enough to equip all the reconnaissance units that needed it. That was sufficient. Perfect was not required when good enough was available in overwhelming numbers. The SDKFZ 251 half-track was also not a remarkable vehicle. It was adequate for the threats anticipated when it was designed, but those threats evolved faster than German industry could respond. By the time the inadequacies became apparent in combat, it was too late to redesign and retool production. The vehicle remained in service not because it was good enough, but because there was nothing better available in sufficient quantities to replace it. The German soldiers who climbed into half-tracks, knowing that American armoured cars could kill them, faced a terrible choice. They could refuse to perform their missions, which meant abandoning their comrades and their duty, or they could continue performing their missions, accepting the risk that inadequate equipment imposed. They chose to continue, and many died because of it. Their courage was real, their professionalism was real, but courage and professionalism could not defeat 37mm armor-piercing rounds travelling at 2,600 feet per second through 8mm of steel plate. The American crews who engaged these German vehicles faced no such dilemma. Their equipment worked, their training prepared them, their industrial base supported them. They performed their missions with confidence that their tools were adequate for the task. This psychological advantage, this confidence born from material superiority, was as important as the actual material differences. Soldiers who trust their equipment fight differently than soldiers who know their equipment is inadequate. When those first rounds penetrated the half-track armour at Stavelot, they proved something that would echo through military planning for decades afterward. In modern industrial warfare, material matters, production capacity matters, logistical systems matter. No amount of tactical skill, fighting spirit, or battlefield experience can overcome fundamental material inadequacy when the disparity is large enough and sustained long enough. The German troops, who called the M8 Greyhound a scout car, were not wrong based on the vehicle's designated role, but they were catastrophically wrong about what that scout car could do to their vehicles. The 37mm gun they had dismissed as obsolete was perfectly adequate for killing half-tracks. By the time they learned this lesson, thousands of German soldiers had already died in vehicles whose armour could not protect them from weapons their enemy considered standard equipment on reconnaissance vehicles. That gap between perception and reality, between what German intelligence assessed and what German soldiers experienced in combat, defined much of the late-war German military experience. Equipment that had seemed adequate in 1939 was revealed as inadequate by 1944. Tactics that had worked against weaker opponents failed against the industrial might of the United States. Assumptions about American capabilities proved wrong when tested in combat. For the historians who later studied these engagements, the lesson was clear. Wars between industrial powers are won by the side that can produce more, supply more, sustain more, and replace losses faster. Individual battles, individual weapons, individual acts of courage matter in the moment, but the cumulative weight of industrial capacity decides the outcome over time. The M8 Greyhound killing German half-tracks was simply one small example of this larger truth playing out across 1,000 battlefields in dozens of countries over 6 years of global conflict. The men who fought in these vehicles, on both sides, understood this truth, even if they could not articulate it in strategic terms. They knew what worked and what did not. They knew which side had better equipment, more supplies, and greater industrial backing. They continued fighting because that was their duty, but they fought with clear-eyed understanding of the material realities that shaped their chances of survival. 70 years later, the M8 Greyhound exists in museums and private collections, preserved as an example of American World War II armoured vehicles. The SDKFZ 251 half-track also survives in museums, representing German mechanized warfare. Visitors can examine both vehicles, can see the 37mm gun that proved so effective and the 8mm armour that proved so inadequate. The mathematics that determined the outcome of their encounters remains unchanged. Physics does not care about courage, doctrine, or national identity. A 37mm round with sufficient velocity will penetrate 8mm armour. That was true in December 1944, and it remains true today. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe